I never imagined how drastically our lives would change after moving into that house. It was a quaint little place in Thornton Heath, a peaceful suburb with neatly lined streets and well-kept gardens. The kind of place where you'd think nothing ever went wrong. We were a typical family just looking for a fresh start. Little did we know this house had other plans. The trouble started almost immediately after we settled in. It was small things at first. I remember the day I found the clock in the hallway ticking backwards. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the cheap batteries I'd put in when we unpacked. But then, it wasn't just the clock. The lights began flickering every night at exactly 2:13 a.m. The bulbs were new, the wiring checked by an electrician who swore everything was fine. Yet every night, without fail, the house plunged into darkness, save for those few erratic flashes. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing in my room. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained my ears. The sound was coming from the corner, where the shadows seemed thicker, darker. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling, but the moment I flipped it on, the breathing stopped, and the shadows in the corner dissipated into nothing. I told myself it was just a dream, but I knew better. Things escalated quickly after that. The furniture in the living room would rearrange itself when no one was looking. We'd leave the room for just a moment, only to return to the armchair facing the wall, the coffee table flipped over, or the sofa dragged halfway across the room. I tried to ignore it, but there was no denying the malevolent presence that had settled into our home. The old dresser was the centerpiece of it all. We had bought it from an antique shop, a beautifully carved piece that seemed to fit perfectly in the master bedroom. But it wasn't long before we began to regret bringing it into our home. It started with the drawers opening and closing by themselves. At first, I thought it was just a draft, but then, we started finding things inside that didn't belong to us. A tarnished locket, a child's broken toy, a yellowed photograph of a woman whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. One night, I decided to confront whatever it was that had taken over our lives. I waited until everyone was asleep, the house silent except for the creaks and groans that had become all too familiar. I stood before the dresser, the air around it thick with something I couldn't quite describe, something heavy, oppressive. The moment I touched the top drawer, a freezing cold shot through my fingers, and the lights in the room exploded, showering the floor with shards of glass. I stumbled back, heart racing, only to be met with a bone-chilling sight. The woman from the photograph stood at the foot of the bed, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. She was translucent, her form wavering as if struggling to hold itself together. Her eyes, those hollow black voids, bored into mine, and in that instant I knew she wasn't just a ghost. She was something far worse, something that had been trapped for far too long and was now lashing out in pure, unbridled rage. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as she slowly pointed at the dresser, her finger extending unnaturally long, the joints cracking with the movement. I followed her gaze to the dresser, and as I did, the top drawer began to open, creaking loudly in the stillness of the room. Inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A human finger, severed clean at the knuckle, resting atop a bundle of old yellowed letters. Before I could react, the lights flickered back on and she was gone. The dresser was closed, the room exactly as it had been. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that whatever was in this house wasn't going to leave us alone, not until it got what it wanted. The next day I told my family about what had happened, but they just looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. They didn't understand, not yet, but they would soon enough. The worst was yet to come. I was convinced that the dresser was the key to everything. Whatever force had latched onto our family, it was centered around that cursed piece of furniture. I couldn't shake the image of that severed finger, the way it lay so unnaturally in the drawer, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I knew I had to do something, but the fear of what might happen next kept me paralyzed. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. My family noticed the change in me, but how could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? I decided to keep the details to myself, to figure it out alone. But that wasn't going to be easy, not with the way the house seemed to be closing in around us. The activity escalated, becoming more violent with each passing day. Doors slammed shut on their own, rattling the frames with such force that they left cracks in the walls. Objects flew across rooms, narrowly missing us more than once. My wife found herself pushed down the stairs by an unseen force, and our son was waking up with deep scratches on his back, as if something had been clawing at him in his sleep. We all started sleeping with the lights on, huddled together in the living room, but even that didn't stop the terror. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The dread that filled our home had grown unbearable, suffocating. I needed answers, needed to know what we were dealing with. I waited until everyone was asleep, then grabbed a crowbar from the garage. If that dresser was the source, then I was going to destroy it, tear it apart piece by piece until there was nothing left for the entity to hold on to. As I approached the dresser, the house seemed to groan in protest. The walls creaked, and the temperature plummeted. my breath visible in the air. I hesitated for a moment, the crowbar heavy in my hand, but then I steeled myself and jammed it into the top drawer. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and as it did, the room was suddenly filled with an overwhelming stench of decay, like something that had been rotting for years. The drawer flew open with a violent force, sending me staggering back. Inside was not just the finger I had seen before, but a full decaying hand, its flesh blackened and falling away from the bone. And there was something else, a thick, leather-bound journal, stained with dark reddish-brown spots that I could only assume were old blood. I grabbed the journal, my hands trembling as I opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. They told the story of a man who had once lived in our house, a man obsessed with the occult, who had performed unspeakable rituals, sacrificing those he lured into his home in exchange for power. The journal detailed how he had used the dresser as a vessel, trapping the souls of his victims within it, their remains hidden in secret compartments. The journal ended abruptly with a final entry that sent chills down my spine. I have sealed her within, but she grows stronger. She is restless, vengeful. I fear what will happen if the seal is broken. May God have mercy on anyone who dares disturb her slumber. The moment I finished reading, the dresser began to shake violently, the drawers slamming open and shut on their own. A loud, inhuman scream erupted from within, so loud it felt like it was tearing through my skull. The house was alive with a malevolent energy, every window and door rattling as if the entire structure was about to come down around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the house now eerily still. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But there was no time to process it because at that moment, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of someone whispering my name, a soft, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around looking for the source, but there was nothing, no one. And yet, I could feel a presence, something dark and malicious watching me, waiting. Before I could react, the whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the hallway toward the bedroom where my family slept. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I ran to the bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But when I threw open the door, I found my family still asleep, seemingly undisturbed. The footsteps had stopped. The house once again silent. But I knew, deep down, I knew that whatever had been unleashed from that dresser was now free, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed what it wanted. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door, keeping watch, the crowbar clutched tightly in my hands. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent me into a state of high alert. But the night passed without further incident, leaving me to wonder if it had all been a nightmare, a twisted hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But as dawn broke, I heard a low growl like the sound of a wild animal coming from the hallway. And that's when I saw it, just for a split second. A dark, shadowy figure standing at the end of the corridor, watching me with glowing red eyes. It disappeared as soon as I blinked, leaving me questioning my sanity. I knew I had to do something, but what? How do you fight something that isn't bound by the rules of our world? Something that can slip into the darkness, out of sight but never out of reach? The days following that night were a waking nightmare. The air in the house felt charged, heavy with a sense of impending doom. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak, every shift of the shadows sent a jolt of fear through me, and I knew we were no longer alone. But the worst part was that my family had started to feel it too. My wife became increasingly distant, her once warm eyes now clouded with a fear she couldn't explain. She spoke less, jumped at the smallest noises, and took to pacing the house at odd hours, muttering to herself about things she couldn't quite remember saying. Our son, once full of life and energy, grew pale and withdrawn, his nights plagued by horrific nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. I tried to shield them, to protect them from the horrors I had uncovered, but it was too late. The darkness had found its way into their hearts, and it was feeding off our fear. Then came the scratches. At first they appeared as small marks on the walls, like something with claws had been raking at the plaster in frustration. But soon the marks grew more numerous, deeper, until entire sections of the house were covered in gouges. The sound of scratching became a constant in the background, a sinister chorus that followed us from room to room. Even worse, the marks started appearing on our skin. They began as faint lines, almost invisible, but with each passing day, they deepened, as if whatever was tormenting us was getting closer, more aggressive. One evening, I found my wife standing in front of the dresser, her hand hovering just above the surface as if drawn to it by some unseen force. She didn't seem to notice me enter the room. her gaze locked onto the cracked mirror hanging above the dresser. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something off about it, something wrong. The reflection seemed to move on its own, lagging a second behind her real movements, its eyes too wide, its smile too forced. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaky. She turned to me, her face pale, eyes glazed over with a distant look. "It's calling to me," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I can hear it. In my head. It wants me to open it." I stepped forward, gently pulling her away from the dresser. "No, you mustn't," I said firmly. "Whatever is in there, it's dangerous. We need to get rid of it." But she resisted, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't. I need to know. I have to see." "No," I insisted, pulling her into an embrace. "We'll figure this out, but not like this. We can't let it win." She nodded slowly, but I could feel the tremor in her body, the struggle within her. Whatever was inside that dresser, it had already sunk its claws into her. I knew then that time was running out. We needed to get out of that house, away from whatever malevolent force had taken hold of us. But the house had other plans. That night, as we huddled together in the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to stave off the bone-chilling cold that swept through the room. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. My son whimpered and my wife clutched my arm, her grip tight with fear. I fumbled for the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. As I clicked it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that made my blood freeze. The walls were covered in writing, words scrawled in a language I didn't understand, written in what looked like blood. The letters seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the house, growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us. My son screamed and my wife started to sob, her fear breaking through her earlier detachment. And then the dresser. It began to shake violently, the drawers slamming open and shut, as if something inside was trying to force its way out. The mirror above it cracked, spiderwebbing outwards until it shattered completely, the pieces falling to the floor with a deafening crash. Suddenly the room was filled with an overwhelming pressure, like the very air was being sucked out of the space. The footsteps grew louder, faster, until they stopped right in front of us. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of light, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just inches away from us, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it reached out a hand, long bony fingers that ended in sharp claws, toward my wife. I lunged forward, swinging the flashlight like a weapon, but the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of its laughter behind. The pressure in the room lifted, and the lights flickered back on, revealing the room in disarray. Furniture overturned, the walls stained with blood, the dresser now wide open, its contents spilled across the floor. Amid the chaos, I spotted the journal, its pages open to the last entry. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. A single word scrawled in blood-red ink at the bottom of the page. "Run!" I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed my family and we ran. We ran out of that house, leaving everything behind, not daring to look back. The door slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the ground, and as we reached the street, the entire house seemed to sigh. A long, mournful sound, like a beast settling back into its lair, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it. But as we caught our breath, the cold night air stinging our lungs, I knew it wasn't over. The darkness that had plagued us was still out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it found us again. We didn't go back to the house, not even to collect our belongings. I didn't care about the furniture, the photos, or even the heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. The only thing that mattered was keeping my family safe, far away from that cursed place. We stayed in a small hotel on the outskirts of town, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the events of those past few weeks lingered like a dark cloud over us. My wife barely spoke, her once bright spirit dimmed by the terror we had endured. My son clung to her, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting the shadows to leap out at him. I felt helpless, unable to protect them from the horror that had invaded our lives. But deep down I knew I couldn't run forever. The entity that had haunted us wasn't just tied to the house. It had a connection to us, a bond that needed to be broken if we were ever to find peace. I needed answers. So I sought out the help of a local historian who specialized in the occult. She was an older woman, with eyes that had seen too much, and a voice that carried the weight of years of knowledge. When I told her about the house, the dresser, and the journal, she listened intently, her expression grave. "You're dealing with something ancient," she said finally, "something that feeds on fear and despair. The entity you encountered isn't just a ghost. It's a manifestation of all the dark energy that's been trapped in that house for centuries. The man who wrote the journal, he may have thought he could control it, but in reality he only made it stronger. And now it's latched onto you and your family. I felt a chill run down my spine. Is there any way to stop it, to break the connection? She nodded slowly. There is, but it won't be easy. You need to confront it, not with fear, but with courage. You need to face the entity head-on and reject it. Destroy the source of its power, the dresser, and cleanse the house with a ritual that will seal the darkness away for good. The thought of returning to that house filled me with dread, but I knew she was right. If we ever wanted to live in peace again, we had to face our fears. So, with the historian's guidance, I prepared myself for what would be the most terrifying night of my life. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, we made our way back to the house. The sight of it sent a shiver through me, but I steeled myself, clutching the tools the historian had given me. A bundle of sage, a vial of holy water, and a small silver crucifix. My wife and son stayed in the car, their faces pale but determined. They understood that this was something I had to do alone. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was resisting my presence. The temperature dropped, and I could hear the faint whispers of the entity, taunting me, trying to worm its way into my mind. But I wouldn't let it. I made my way to the master bedroom, where the dresser stood, still as imposing as ever, the air around it thick with malevolent energy. With trembling hands, I lit the sage, waving it around the room as the historian had instructed. The smoke filled the space and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, but I pressed on. I sprinkled the holy water on the dresser, the droplets hissing as they made contact, leaving small, sizzling marks on the wood. The dresser began to shake, the drawers opening and closing violently, but I held my ground. "This is my home," I said, my voice strong, filled with resolve. "You have no power here. I reject you. I banish you. Leave us in peace." The entity let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound so intense it felt like it was tearing through my very soul. But I didn't falter. I took the crowbar and drove it into the heart of the dresser, splintering the wood with all my strength. The dresser cracked open, and a dark, shadowy mist poured out, swirling around me, trying to envelop me in its icy grip. But I was ready. I held up the crucifix, and the mist recoiled, shrieking as it dissolved into nothingness. The room grew brighter, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the darkness faded away. The dresser lay in pieces, its power broken, its connection to the entity severed. For a moment there was silence, peaceful, soothing silence. Then, as if on cue, the morning sun began to peek through the windows, casting warm golden light across the room. The house felt different, lighter, as if it had been cleansed of all the evil that had once dwelled within its walls. I walked outside, the weight on my chest finally lifting as I saw my wife and son waiting for me, their eyes filled with hope. I knew then that the nightmare was over. We had faced our fears and we had won. We never returned to live in that house, of course. We sold it to someone who was unaware of its dark history. Though, after the cleansing, I was confident it would be just another ordinary house. We moved far away, to a place where the sun always seemed to shine, where the air was fresh and filled with the scent of flowers, not the stench of decay. My wife slowly found her smile again, and our son regained his playful spirit. The nightmares stopped, the scratches healed, and the shadows that had once haunted us were now just a distant memory. We found peace, true peace, and we never took it for granted. I'll never forget what we went through, and I'll always be wary of the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. But I also learned something important. No matter how powerful the darkness, it can always be driven away by the light of courage, love, and the strength of a family that stands together. And in the end, that's what saved us.